Good afternoon, and welcome to the closing plenary for the 2019 Noyce Summit. Before we get started with our announcements and our final plenary, we're going to take a minute for an advertisement from Larry Hovarth for the regional conferences.
Okay, so I'm Larry Horvath, and I'm at San Francisco State University, but in this context, I'm also the principal investigator for the Western Regional Noyce Alliance. And what we do is we work to put on the annual regional conferences for the 14 Western states, but I also have my colleague up here, Jess Krim. We want to let you know of the conference opportunities that are coming up within the next year or two for all of you, and when you get emails from us that you can, PIs really support your scholars, and scholars be really excited about attending these wonderful professional development opportunities. So I'll let Jess here tell you a little bit about the first one that's coming up in November.
Great. Hello. If you haven't been up here, I just want to let you know these lights are bright. I can barely see any of you, but I can see if you raise your hand. So raise your hand if you're from the Midwest. Oh, there's a lot of you. Fantastic. All right, so the next regional conference is the Midwest Conference. It's coming up in November, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. So please keep an eye out on the email to get an invitation. We have a couple of really great components to the Midwest Conference. There's a sub-award component where you can apply for funds to do projects in your classroom, or if you're a teacher-educator, projects within your classroom in the teacher-educator realm. Also, it's the lights. The lights are so bright. So the other thing that's really unique about that is that we have field trips. Part of our conference is that we take you out into the community. You get to experience local things and then think about how to incorporate math and science and STEM concepts in your own classroom. And I'll hand it over to Larry.
Thank you, Jess. And so I'll be quick. We also have a Southeast Regional Conference coming up in June 2020. The PI is Andre Green. If he's in the house, he can stand up and wave. I can't see anything. And in the West, we have two regional conferences planned. The first one coming up in February 19th, 2020 in Portland, Oregon, run by Stephanie Salamone from University of Portland. And the second one in 2021, San Diego, California, with the PI Donna Ross. And I know San Diego State's in the house, so I knew that, so thank you. And there's Donna right there. And last but not least, we also have our Northeast Regional Conference planned for June 2020, location to be arranged, and that's with the PI Greg Phelan. So thank you all. It's great. We love supporting this, and we know you all have been to the regional conferences and find out that they're a really worthwhile experience for you guys to meet other scholars, other fellows, other teachers, PIs to network, and to get some great professional development. So thank you very much, Jennifer.
Okay, so when you came in, you found some evaluations on your table. If you could take some time to fill those out sometime between now and before you leave this room. If you could leave it at your table before you exit, and our staff will be around to pick it up. So in addition to the evaluations, you've been telling us a little bit about what you think on Twitter. So we have our last round of Twitter, and our final drum roll, please. Dr. Camille McHale, FIUDC, Vanessa Roster, Victoria Peruli, Paul Dams, Susan Ferguson, You Teach Maker, Professor Nicole Guglivsky, and Ariana Shakabia. If you could come see my colleague Allison up here and see what you've won. Come on down, the price is right. All right. You will see on your way out on that table where you receive some handouts, there are some very huge books called atlases. They are from our AAAS colleagues at Project 2061, and we're gracious enough to share those. We would love for you to take those with you. So please take advantage of them and take them with you on your way out, on your way home, and keep them or give them to somebody you know would put them to good use. And finally, it would be remiss if we did not thank all the people who made this possible to be here today. So first, I'd like to thank all of the NSF Noyce program officers, in particular, Kathleen Bergin and Sandra Richardson. If we could give them a round of applause, please. All of our AAAS staff who have worked on this project, some that you've seen here, our great customer service at the registration desk, and our other colleagues who've been helping out throughout, as well as our meetings and marketing departments and finance and leadership who've worked on this in the background for months. So if you could please give them a hand for allowing this to happen. I'd also like to thank our wonderful group of Noyce advisors that had a pre-meeting before this, and they help inform the content of our work for this piece of our grant and our broader research community. So thank you to our advisors, and if you're in the room, if you could please stand. Next, I'd like our discussion and roundtable leaders to please stand. So if you were able to join in a conversation with these guys, please give them a hand for volunteering and for sharing the notes, because we do use these notes to inform not only the next session that you're going to hear from Shirley and Kathleen, but also for our larger work and reports and getting a pulse on the field for the topic of this conference, as well as broader research that you are doing in your projects. So thank you so much for contributing to the discussion groups. I'd also like to thank all of our workshop presenters. If you could please stand, whether you presented today or yesterday. And again, for our wonderful poster presenters, if you could stand. Of course, our plenary speakers throughout the event. And the other people who've been behind the scenes making this happen are PSAV techs over there behind the curtain. Our Hyatt staff who've helped out and made this run smoothly. Our photographer here in the front, Mike Colella. And our vendor Freeman, who put up all those poster boards in the back. So thank you to everyone for your contributions, and particularly thank you to all of you who've been such an engaged and participatory audience and contributors throughout this whole event. Thank you.
So, welcome to Shirley and Kathleen's living room. Before we get started with the synthesis, on behalf of the Noyce team, especially Sandra Richardson and all of my colleagues, we want to thank Jennifer and AAAS for this amazing meeting. If I was brand new to teaching, I wouldn't know what a significant partnership it is to have AAAS, this huge international scientific organization that is investing in our work. So I just want to thank AAAS for being part of the Noyce community. So this really is a conversation, and it's our attempt at synthesizing some things. And last year, Shirley and I had the opportunity to have a conversation at the end of the meeting to try to pull together the richness. And Shirley is an ecologist by training. And so immediately she framed everything in terms of an ecosystem. And it was a very lovely framing, and it worked. So this year when we were going to do this, because I have a lot of chutzpah, I said, we're not using the ecosystem. Again, because we used the ecosystem last year. And so Shirley just smiled. She didn't push back.
And I said, okay.
And then all of these speakers kept coming up here and talking about the ecosystem with policy. And so the next
Yes.
day, I looked at Shirley and I said,
I take it back.
"Yes."
That's what she said. She said, I take it all back. You know, the thing is that it's like, okay, I'm a card-carrying ecologist who has been told that you cannot use the metaphor of an ecosystem. Think about it, people. Just think about it. But I'm glad that Kathleen relented, because actually it really is the best metaphor for what we're talking about. And just so that the mathematicians in the room do not feel as though I am discriminating against them by using the notion of ecosystem, I told people, I said, you know, quite frankly, we do modeling within ecosystems all the time. When we talk about things like evolution and the progression of species, it all depends on the proportions of alleles within populations. I mean, we have lots of love for Hardy Weinberg. So,
And all of that is to make the invisible visible, which is a huge message that has been brought to us all. So we're going to navigate through this ecosystem a little bit.
yeah, well, the thing is that we were given let's go back. We were given a really nice way to start by Tanika when she talked about the whole question of making that which is invisible visible. And it, in fact, really set us up for the kind of conversation that we need to have around a lot of things, not just the students, but the content and what have you. So you'll hear that us return to that theme again and again throughout this conversation. I told Kathleen that one of the things that I really wanted to look at was the concept of keystone species, and that it meant a lot to me, in part because this whole notion of keystone species was developed by one of my mentors at the University of Washington, Bob Payne. And so when we start talking about our ecosystem, which relates to the development of the teachers and the retention of the teachers, what was our metaphor? What was our analogous keystone species? And that a keystone species is kind of the element that holds together the ecosystem and that maintains the diversity within the ecosystem. And so we started talking about what is that within what we're talking about, and decided that it really was the whole question of teacher preparation as a kind of a keystone. That was the element that we really needed to depend upon to maintain the health overall, but also the diversity within the species. So we're going to kind of continue that metaphor as we go through and really think around the larger theme of retention as we move through this discussion.
And you have to know that I'm a biologist by training, but I'm an educator by passion. And Shirley was giving me an ecology test yesterday, asking me, do you know what a keystone, do you know what an indicator species is? And we came to agreement that teacher preparation in this ecosystem of STEM workforce, of STEM education, teacher preparation is that keystone.
Yep.
But we also have some indicator species.
Yes, we do have indicator species. Unfortunately, our female students and our kids of color are indicator species of the lack of health in many cases of the work that we are doing here. The lack of diversity among our STEM teachers is an indicator of the work that still needs to be done. And I think that if we think about it like that and use the metrics that come out of our programs, we can begin to understand where our real challenges are and how we might begin to start addressing some of those challenges.
But I have to tell you, one of the things that has excited me about this indicator species is the number and diversity of and power of the Noyce scholars that we've had with us
Yes.
for these last 2 days. So kudos to your programs for seeking you out, and kudos to all of you for stepping up and asking questions during the course of things. If all of our Noyce scholars are as amazing as the set that I've had the opportunity to interact with, we're in a good place in this ecosystem.
Yeah, part of the aspect that we were talking about was that within any of these kinds of organizations, there is the reality of the power dynamics that exist, and we have to acknowledge them, that sometimes they can in fact be impediments to being able to move forward. We understand predator and prey, but the whole notion that in some cases we have things that work against being able to move forward, and we might as well call them out. And we've heard a lot of calling out in the discussion groups, especially around the whole question of policy.
Yes, and we were fortunate to have some people that use policy in their names to talk with us, but many of you brought forward policy issues that create barriers, and some of you brought forth policy issues that are actually supportive. But this is all part of a power dynamic, and part of this power dynamic has to do with your individual position in the ecosystem. So there are power dynamics. First, stop and think about where you locate yourself in the ecosystem of education, STEM education. And unfortunately, sometimes there are power dynamics that we need to work through and dissipate, such as when you want to bring together community colleges working with four-year colleges. We're trying to make the invisible visible, so let's just call it out and say that sometimes four-year institutions can have an arrogance that they do a better job or they know more, they do research.
I know, and oftentimes when there's a discussion about how well someone has learned something, the assumptions that are made are often with no base in evidence. And I think that is how well did the two-year institution do in the chemistry versus how well the four-year institution might have done in teaching chemistry. And therefore, whether or not I will accept the credits then going from one place to another. There are all of these things that really interact around this issue of policy and position. Whether you think that you are higher in the quote-unquote peck order than, in fact, the other group. We have that among the disciplines. We, in fact, even the way that we order the disciplines. For years, Leon Letterman argued for doing like Science 1, which is mostly physics, Science 2, which is mostly chemistry, and Science 3, which is mostly biology, for example. And the physics people didn't necessarily like that. They felt that they were at the top of the queue and that they needed to stay there. So this whole question about positioning, about the mathematics and the kind of mathematics that students have and the kind of the positioning of mathematics in relation to all of the other disciplines. And now we are emerging and with the notion of what are we going to do about computer science? Computing as both the field and computing as a tool, because we are all totally dependent on these as we go into actually looking at and studying our work.
And there can also be power dynamics between the disciplinary faculty and the education faculty.
Oh,
and,
that's
and
the
any other
ultimate
set.
power dynamic.
But you know, if we go back, many of you, I almost want to say all, but many of you have engaged in doing work with culturally responsive teaching or things of that genre. And one of the things that you learn when you get into that work, and I've seen it in posters and I've
Yes.
seen it, is funds of knowledge. And when students come to you, getting to know them and accessing their funds of knowledge. The same thing is true when you're in a power dynamic. If you recognize that the other who is sitting before you has knowledge to bring that is going to enrich
Right.
the
Why
work,
aren't you accessing it?
it changes the power dynamic.
Yes, but why aren't you accessing it? And I think that's another part that we tend not to talk about. And I'm willing to talk about the fact that with regard to content faculty, that in many cases, we just don't acknowledge the fact that we were never taught to teach. You know, I walked out with my PhD in a content area, and I was dropped into a classroom, and somehow I'm supposed to know what I'm doing when I get there, when I have never been taught to teach. Now, in my case, I had an advantage. I had taught high school. I had actually had a methods class. I had had to actually experience what it was like on the first day. I had had a first day. So, but what happens with regard to this? And yet somehow in that power dynamic, these conversations never really play out in meaningful ways of, can I learn from here and move it to here?
So when Shirley and I started this conversation, which was before we turned the mics on, the word, what can institutions do to provide, related to this issue of retention. And I looked at Shirley and I challenged the word provide. We need to do something very different together.
Yeah, absolutely. We need to acknowledge what different groups bring, and therefore what we make of that is a process that looks more like co-creation. And so even our language has to be changed. This is again of making the dynamic visible. And we walk around these issues all the time, but I think that we cannot move forward unless we confront them.
And one of our voices from the field scholars, a brand new teacher, talked about this co-creation even with his students when he said to all of us, I realized that I was the one that was learning the most in this teaching. So if we approach everything from the funds of knowledge notion, that you have things that I can benefit from, and you have things that I have contributions that I can make, we have an opportunity for co-creation.
Absolutely, but the other part of that is that it does away with the deficit model. It basically builds off of assets, and you're putting assets together rather than trying to plug in somebody's deficits. And that totally changes the conversation. But we also talked about partnerships and the real value of partnerships, and almost every discussion group talked about partnerships. Partnerships, not just with the faculty who may come from one place or another, partnerships between two-year institutions and four-year institutions, partnerships with communities and what communities have to offer. But what we don't talk about is what it actually takes to make a partnership work. You can't just basically show up and say, okay, sign on to my proposal. Trust me. And I don't even know who you are. I mean, part of the reason that we are able to have these kinds of conversations is that we bring decades of relationship. And other part is this whole notion of partnership. Partnerships really don't work except among equals. And if you don't actually respect the other people and what they bring, you're going to have a really rough time in creating a partnership. But everybody talks about partnerships, and they're right.
Which goes back to the power dynamic that we just talked about. But also in this partnership, we had a policy person up here yesterday that advocated that you ought to get in touch with policymakers. You have a voice there. You have a reason to get with them. And so the partnerships are in all different ways. And we saw partnerships even in the social networking work. And who do you go to? And who do you contribute to?
Right.
Which is all part of symbiotic relationships.
Right, that you're essentially giving to each other in ways that are really meaningful, and that there is this opportunity to learn from each other, an opportunity to support each other, and that's the way that you're getting through. And I think that's really an important idea, that it's okay to ask for help. It's absolutely a good thing to give help. And then you talked about the fact that maybe there was a third thing, and that is to give help, not just when it's asked for, but when there is a perceived need that actually appears.
And I saw a lot of projects here talking to other projects and saying, you know, I want to understand more about what you're doing, because I see that that's something that our project can really benefit from. So I hope the conversations that have started here, I know when you get home you're going to be really busy, but these are really important conversations. And I'm going to go back to the scholars again. I went to some presentations where the scholars were presenting. Right. I was blown away.
Yes.
Because they're young in our profession, but there's some wisdom there that we can all tap into. So,
well,
Shirley, what matters?
Everything.
Okay.
I mean, that's the nature of a system, that all of these issues matter. I mean, I've heard more conversations around the issue of place mattering. If I want to attract people to work in a high needs region, I've got to help them understand what that looks like, and be able to anticipate and expect how I'm going to have to operate. And we're seeing this information coming from the projects that are essentially telling us that if people are doing their student teaching in a high needs area, that they're more likely to remain in a high needs area. We've seen examples of where people come and spend time in a rural community. They begin to understand the rhythm of these communities. So place, for example, place matters. And I guess place and placement, and we've got to really kind of respect the need to look at that and to provide a kind of suitable context, because context always matters. Community matters. Not just the community in which you find yourself, in which you're placed, but the community that you build around you in order to support you. We know that content matters, and we've had these content discussions over and over again, and this notion about how do you basically make the content relevant to students. And that's one of the things. Oftentimes we will go to and look at programs that focus directly just on practice and things that I could practically take into my classroom, when in fact a lot of the grist, a lot of the context is within the content material itself. You know, I think I shared with you, I'm a sickle cell carrier, and that has a lot of meaning, not only for me, but it has meaning for my children. It has meaning for my life and the way that I live my life. because if I am going into an area that has malaria, it's true, I do have a certain advantage in that I'm a heterozygote, you know.
So I don't know how many people knew that sickle cell carriers, she does not have sickle cell, but carriers, it was beneficial in that ecosystem.
In that environment, which is why the allele was retained in the population.
Because they wouldn't get malaria.
So you got it, but the impact was much different.
Right.
But it affects, for example, when I go into an area that does have malaria, I can't use what most people use as the antimalarial because it doesn't react the same way with me. I have to use a totally different structure, but I have to know that about myself. Okay, that's a piece of content I've got to know about me and the implications of that for the way the prophylactic that I would choose as I would be going into this space. Well, a lot of the information, for example, about stem cell trials around to deal with sickle cell, that's not in the teacher journals, that's in the content journals. So our relationships with our content disciplinary areas, we can't just chuck that off. We've got to remember that that's one of the people that we happen to be. And so preparation matters. The kinds of skills and tools that we are being given in our programs, that's going to be a major aspect to whether or not we're going to be able to retain people. Because if they don't have the skills that they need when they get to the classroom, they're going to be more likely to give up on themselves with regard to remaining in that space.
And we do have data that shows
Yes.
that when teachers have the toolkit that they need to be successful in the classroom, they feel, and I'm going to use one of the voices from the fields words yesterday, validated, that they can help others learn to love what they love,
Right.
which is both learning, they love learning. If you're in the room and you don't love learning, would you please leave? No. Teachers love learning, and they love their content.
Yes.
And when they learn how to learn about their individual students and what their individual students not only bring to the work, but some of the things they struggle with, especially students in the high needs situations, then they have a toolkit that those of you that are working to help prepare them and co-creating with them what they need,
Right.
not only in the preparation, but I don't think preparation stops when the student graduates.
No.
But all the way into their early years of teaching, where you're a resource, but you're also asking them what are the kinds of things that they're learning so that you can learn those things. We keep seeing this dynamic where in an ecosystem we can all benefit from what's happening in other parts of the ecosystem.
Well, you're still picking up information and tools and ideas, and that is the thing, that's the dynamism within the system. And it is a static system does not continue. Okay,
Right.
So that's the dynamism that you have. But a lot of these things do matter. The policies matter. You can basically make it so miserable for people that they just give up. The money matters. You can basically offer so much more that it makes it really hard for people to stay in place. You can go down the road 5 miles and find $15,000 more and a lot less worry. That's an issue. And I think that we just have to acknowledge that that's one of the things that you have to take on. Having support matters, and we've heard that over and over and over again. It makes it a lot easier. You know, there's a song for that. I get by with a little help from my friends. Okay?
Are you going to sing for us?
Or a lot of help from my friends. But, you know, I think that we started, when Tanika started with the whole notion of culture and sustaining culture. And one of the things I hope that we will make visible is that we lost our, yes, okay. One of the things that I hope that we will make visible is that actually our disciplines have culture. There's a culture to mathematics, there's a culture to physics, there are cultures within our fields, but then there are also the culture of faculty, the culture of teachers. You have a culture, and I think that it is a mistake to try to deculturize yourself, because students respond to the authentic person, to the authentic you. And then there's the culture of our students. And Tanika warned us from the beginning that we need to try to understand it and to respect it, because it can become a real issue if we are trying to provide content in a situation that does not respect the culture that the students happen to bring into that situation.
And then the culture actually turns out to be an asset. But unfortunately, or fortunately, because it'll keep us all working very hard, we need research and we need it to matter. And so it's not just about doing the research, but we've got to work on making it matter. And so I'm going to go back to the making it more visible, to the policymakers, to the people with the money, to the support systems. We need more research in all of these areas.
Absolutely, but I think that there may be another thing that's not up there, and that is we need narrative. We need to be able to tell our stories a lot better than we are about the jobs that we are being asked to do, about the challenges that we are facing, and about the absolute criticality of getting this right.
And the successes.
And the successes.
We need to broadcast the successes.
Yes.
And there's so many successes in this room. I mean, so it's something that, yes, we need to work on, and we may need to invite more people into our community that can help us frame narrative.
Yes, absolutely.
Now, one of the things we've heard throughout the meeting is how important exposure is. You talked earlier about students that are going to teach in a rural space having the opportunity to experience that, students that are going to teach in an urban space. I'd say faculty that are going to prepare teachers to teach in an urban space need to have some experience in the urban space. Many of your projects provide early opportunities before a year or two before you're actually going to teach, to engage with students in different kinds of settings so that you can start to learn the narrative of those students and
Yes.
the culture that they bring. But all of this exposure has to be done with I'm going to go back to the toolkit that students need to bring to this work. This is not a sink or swim kind of thing. So we draw your attention to the analogy of sunblocks that can be very helpful to us, even though we want the exposure to the sun, because vitamin D actually is very important in the chemistry of our bodies.
Right.
We don't function without it. But the fact that most of you, if not all of you, are engaged in exposing your students and exposing yourself. And I'm going to say making yourself vulnerable
Yes.
to meeting new people in new cultures, in new places, and learning from and with them.
Well, you remember, since you know about my early life, that I was born and raised in Birmingham, and I am a good bit over 70. And therefore, if you do the math, you understand that I went to segregated schools, and I was only in school with other people who were black, and I was only taught by other people who were black. And when I went to college, I went to the University of Washington in Seattle. Mm-hmm. Anybody ever been to the University of Washington in Seattle? You can know that it does not look like Birmingham. And all of a sudden, I was thrust into a totally different culture. And all of a sudden, I had the people who taught me, I had nobody who looked like me. The people in my class, I had nobody who looked like me. And yet, that experience of coming to know people from so many different other cultures, it totally enriched my life. Kind of like after I got over the panic, you basically situate yourself that you make the most of this exposure. And you set yourself into a situation where you try to learn what those other people have to teach you about their cultures. And I think that we don't do enough of that. Our schools today are more segregated than they have ever been. And the problem with that is that when you go to enter your workforce, you're going with a deficit, with a gap, an exposure gap to people who are different and who are coming from different mindsets and perspectives. And there's so much opportunity when we actually bring these pieces together, because the research says that the innovation emerges, the diversity brings about and supports the innovation and the creativity that we need to kind of solve the problems that we have. So we've got to think our way through, how do we begin to support this kind of immersion in other ways of thinking?
Both for our students that we think of as Noyce scholars, but the students of the Noyce scholars have to have these opportunities.
That's it,
too.
exactly. But so do our Noyce scholars have to have these opportunities.
Yes, absolutely. So I would like to take a moment to ask you to write down the answer to this question for yourself right now. There are pens on every table, there's paper on every table.
And there's paper. Yeah, we kind of started there. Our first plenary started there.
Exactly. But we need to find out who they are,
Yes.
or who they think they are. It is so cool to sit up here and hear the rustling of paper as they answer this question. You're welcome to share with your neighbor if you want to, but you don't have to. But we just want to make sure that going into the next part of the synthesis, because much of this has been about who you are and what matters and making
Absolutely.
the invisible visible. So they've written down something.
Yes, they have
Okay.
written down something.
And we've thought about
And
this.
we've talked about this a lot. And we've talked about the fact that in many cases, we don't even recognize all of the people that we are. And I want to introduce you to a guy. I don't know Leonardo. I don't know whether or not, which Leonardo you know, okay? You know the Leonardo of the Mona Lisa, the Last Supper, or any number of artist kinds of things. Or do you know the Leonardo of any number of engineering and design and science-y kinds of things? Or do you know the Leonardo who is really probably all of those things? Now, Kathleen basically reminded me of something I had forgotten, and that was that there is a lot to suggest that Leonardo was dyslexic, and that a lot of his creativity probably emerged from his sense-making of the world. And I said, oh God, can you imagine how Leonardo would have performed on a standardized test? Because he wrote mirror image, he did all kinds of things. And there is some suggestion in the piece that I read because he started a lot of things and didn't finish them, that he was probably ADHD as well. But the point is that didn't define Leonardo.
No,
Okay.
Leonardo defined Leonardo.
That's it exactly. Leonardo was an engineer and an artist and a sculptor and lots of other things, and contributed to a lot of different areas. But that's not necessarily, that wouldn't necessarily have happened had he basically been kind of stuck in a let's define Leonardo rather than let's let Leonardo define Leonardo.
So we hope that you wrote down more than one thing to the question of who am I? Because why should you have to choose just one thing? I'm looking over here at someone I've known from a number of years, a mathematician, math educator, who hikes and sends me amazing pictures. He's a hiker. I know that there are people in here that are musicians. This is all true of your students too. And so who you are is the contribution you are making to the ecosystem.
Right. And you're a lot of people. And that's one of the things that I found that was very interesting in the comment that Rush said. He wants us to get to the point where our students say, I am a scientist, I am a mathematician, I am an engineer, I am these other people in addition to being whomever else.
But I can also be a rap artist.
That's it.
Well,
exactly.
maybe not me personally, because I have, but I could choose to be that.
That's right.
Along with being a scientist.
That's it, exactly. And so the question is, what works for me? And we talked about we keep coming up with this notion of culturally relevant pedagogy. And I was in a discussion table the other day where we decided that actually it isn't something we just do for the Black kids or for the Native kids or for these kids or those kids, but we all basically need this stuff contextualized for us. We need to be situated in how we relate to the technology or to the engineering or to the mathematics or to the science. That's the way we process. That's the way we make sense out of the world, that just help us, give us these tools, these ways of thinking, so that we can kind of move beyond just science as a body of knowledge. It's not, it's a way of thinking about it.
And I was sharing with Shirley that I was recently negotiating an award. You know, that's what program officers do when they're not having a good time at a conference with you all. And the reviewers had said they would have liked an example of the micro-learning modules that this project was proposing they were going to produce. So I asked for an example. I got a very well-constructed example, and it had a video embedded in it of a teacher with students, and it was not contrived. It was a natural taken video. And I said back to the proposer, well, how are you going to make sure that you can find enough videos to use as your exemplars in the context of this that will have more diversity? Because the classroom in this video was all white. And the proposer came back with an elegant answer and said, we're going to have different kinds of classrooms with different kinds of diversity, but one of the groups that we work with is in rural Appalachia, and they're all white. We want them to understand that culturally relevant pedagogy is not meant
Right.
for just people of color. It's about our students,
Right.
and what they're bringing.
And whoever they are.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So it was really exciting. And it goes back to this. And there's another project, and I think they may even be in the room, But several of you are working and weaving into your work trauma training because of what your students are dealing with in day-to-day life. And you know, Shirley, it'd be very easy for me to sit here and think that it's only the kids in the high-need schools that are dealing with trauma. But I'm sorry, in this day and age of mass shootings in schools, all of our kids go to school with that. And what we can do to help as part of our training of teachers is another tool in the toolkit.
Absolutely. And to deny that that's a part of the reality really is kind of sticking our head in the sand. That's a part of the reality that we are unfortunately now facing. We have homeless kids that we are encountering. We have kids with all kinds of needs.
Well, we
that are
heard
out
one
there.
of our scholars talking about the challenges in the Navajo community, but also the richness that the Navajo community brings to the work, which is all part of helping all of us and teachers and teacher educators understand. And I'm going to say content faculty,
Yes.
because these students, if we do a really great job, are going to be in your classrooms. They're going to become the physics major. They're going to become the chemistry major, but they're going to bring all of this culture with them. And so it's not just for those of us that use the E word, education, but for those of us that may just define ourselves more as a chemist or a mathematician or whatever. And I have not heard a lot about differentiated learning at this meeting, but I've seen some of it here.
Yeah.
So it wasn't labeled that, but ways to help different kinds of learners learn in case Leonardo shows up in your room.
You know, some of my earliest memory of mathematics was as a child when I would put the pieces together for quilting. And you basically have these little triangles that you would sew together and make squares, and then you make bigger squares and bigger squares still. And you'd spend time with my grandmother, you know, in doing this. And I began to understand in a very physical way a lot of things about geometry that I just don't know that my geometry class gave me. Yeah. Okay, I brought that from home, all right? I brought that from the quilting culture of the Black community in the 1950s. And there are a lot of kids who are out there who have these things within their own cultures that you can build on and work with so that they can see that a lot of the things aren't as like abstract.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And by the way, we put an ellipse here because we know that there are many more things that we could include here, but we just want to acknowledge the work that all of you are doing around this in preparing your teachers to have the kind of toolkit that is going to be successful with very diverse learners in very diverse places across our nation. And so I loved this term
Yes.
that we heard from one of our Track 4 researchers that talked about boundary spanning.
I know. The thing that's interesting is that often the greatest innovation is at the edges of different fields. And this notion of boundary spanning, you know, if you're a boundary spanner, and I'm a big-time boundary spanner.
Oh, I know that.
Okay. You will find that there are times when you don't belong because you are neither this nor that. You're both, and you're something else as well. And until those connections are actually made, people can't see where you're trying to take them. And that's really harkens back to last year's theme as well around the whole question of convergence.
Yes.
All right, that in fact that it is that space in between, that highly amorphous at first space, but the need for boundary spanners is absolutely critical. We need faculty who are in the content areas to span over and into the not only other content areas, but also into the pedagogy, into the learning sciences. We need the people to actually make these kinds of connections.
So,
yes, one spanned. I know. One of the things that I think that is really important for us to remember is that we build off of what we have, right? And we build off of who we are. You think about a butterfly basically starts as an egg, and all of the genetic information to go from egg to caterpillar, from caterpillar to pupa, and from pupa to adult is all the same information sitting right there. It's like what gets translated and in what order. And all of those stages are absolutely essential to this kind of emergence. And those are the kinds of this transformative part, I think, that is really, really crucial, because our fields are transformed when we, in fact, span and connect and interconnect. And the relationship that we have, for example, to things like computer science or to engineering or to mathematics from the sciences and bringing those pieces together is absolutely critical. And they provide an opportunity, again, for the students, again, to contextualize and to see how these things relate to them.
and I love this metaphor of this beautiful, I believe it's a monarch butterfly. That's what we're all about becoming. But the students that we have the privilege to work with are all about is this transformation. But as you said, the genetic material is all there already.
From the beginning, absolutely.
So we have to be willing to get out there on the edge of things, right? You said we have to be a little uncomfortable, and we need to do experiments. Now, most of us that come from the science and mathematics and engineering and physics side of things, we're used to doing experiments with stuff, hence the notion of the egg drop. But we also need to engage our students and learn and try to see a better way, not the better way, because the nature of our communities and the students we're serving varies tremendously.
Right, but you have to have I think that sometimes you need permission to try other things, see if something else works with your students. You know, you don't just keep going with the same stuff if it's not working. You go with other kinds of ideas. And I think that that's absolutely crucial, to keep this kind of experimental mindset, of trying new things. If this doesn't work, try a different way to explain it. Have the students try to explain it back to you. Just taking on a very different way of thinking about this kind of co-creation.
So I'm going to go back to the power thing, because you said to me today that sometimes teachers don't realize the power they have.
Yes, they have incredible power. Incredible power. And the power to change lives. My life is changed forever by empowered teachers. And I think that opportunity exists.
And they have the power to close their door.
Yes.
And try some things that are different. And we heard from one of the one of the voices from the field yesterday about, I'll never forget it now, you know?
Yes, diverge.
Divergence and convergence, and what happens at that intersection, all related to plate tectonics. And when I heard that, it made me think about the day that the overhead projector bulb blew in my classroom. We were not allowed to have a spare. You had to take the blown bulb to the library, and you were issued a new bulb. I don't know whether there was a black market for bulbs or something, you know. But I was in the process of working with my chemistry kids with the periodic table. Now, in most every chemistry classroom, there is a periodic table almost the size of the screen, right?
That's right, on the wall.
And there was in this room, and this was a really great lab room, where you had lab tables coming out from the wall like this, and then a big long lab cabinet over here, and the periodic table was up against that wall. So all of a sudden, I didn't have my periodic table on my overhead projector. This is back in the days of acetate. For those of you that are too young to know, you can probably Google it and see what that
what it looks like.
But anyway, so I climbed up on the lab table, and I started going back and forth to the different parts of the periodic table and helping them understand how to orbital configuration. So I'm doing this, but you know, I'm running back and forth on this big thing. So fine, fast forward to a test. And each of them has a test, and I have given each of them their own personal copy of a periodic table so that they can use that to answer questions. But what I see is them doing this. The visual of me going back and forth. They weren't doing it here, they're going like this. So guess what? Every year after that, I didn't have to have a blown bulb. I climbed up on the counter. And that's what I'm saying about this young man, a brand new teacher that has already created an experiment that we have to be willing to find the way to tap into our kids. And I'm going to say that goes for our teaching faculty, both content and education as well. I always felt when my students failed that I was the failure, and that when they succeeded, I did too.
Yes.
And so
Yes.
we were just talking about students.
Students should be the answer to every question. And I think that in many cases, this notion of, with policymakers, understanding it at the end of the day, this is what's really important. And that's the answer to why you do this, that students are, in fact, the important thing. And we're trying to work to create and retain people who believe this and who have the tools to be able to really make this happen. But it takes all of us, and I think that's a really crucial part.
All of us in the ecosystem. And if we can all work on our narrative and wrap it around students, then when we go to those with money who are making decisions, when we go to those who are the policy makers, they understand story and they understand students. If you can always have your conversation wrapped around that,
It makes a difference.
it makes a difference.
It does.
And you know who else makes a difference? Everybody in this room.
Everybody, absolutely.
So we want to make sure that if our conversation, if you went to sleep, we want you to wake up now. We'll give you something to walk out the door with.
Right. I mean, the major takeaways, and that is that there's no one thing that's going to actually address this issue of STEM teacher retention. We've got to think about the ecosystem, but you've got to understand the pressures, and you have to understand, we really need to understand better how we can enable people and what we can provide and co-create to be able to allow this energy to remain within high needs schools. The teacher preparation can be the keystone. And it is, but again, only if we are attentive and that we co-create with the stakeholders. We have a reason to connect to the community, to connect all of the different pieces that are in play at any one time within our system. The major point is that we do continue to need research to inform the work that we're doing. And that's why we keep pushing on track 4. I know you're so sick of track 4 you don't know what to do, but we're going to keep pushing. Oh, okay.
I'm sorry, I'm loving it.
But we're going to keep pushing on it because we need to know more in order to do better. But at the end of the day, you matter. All of you. Every last one of you. The last thing that we want to walk out of here with, if you remember back to Wednesday night, okay, when the image came up of Malcolm X, and Tanika said something like, you got to have a woke people. You matter, but only if you are woke enough in order to help in organizing a movement to make this happen. Now, last year, we actually discovered our theme song, okay? And for those who were not here last year, I want to read the lyrics and then have you process to the song. It's by Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes, okay? And those of you with the lead singer is Teddy Pendergrass, and there are people here who were not born when this came out. It does not matter, you need the song. And it basically says the following: wake up, everybody. No more sleeping in bed. No more backward thinking, time for thinking ahead. The world has changed so very much from what it used to be. There is so much hatred, war, and poverty. Wake up all the teachers, time to teach a new way. Maybe then they'll listen to what you have to say, because they're the ones who's coming up, and the world is in their hands. When you teach the children, teach them the very best you can. The world won't get no better if we just let it be. The world won't get no better. You gotta change it, yeah, just you and me. There we are, cue the sound.
You and me.